talked earlier in our arm lessons about adding an auxiliary elbow or knee control to your limbs. Now in this video we're only going to be looking at arms and elbow controls, but please note that you can also use this exact same technique to create auxiliary knee controls for your legs as well. The steps are exactly the same. And what this control allows us to do is essentially override the natural position the elbow would go into based on the IK system, and allows you to position the elbow manually without breaking the IK chain, and the elbow continues to respond to the IK chain even while you are able to position it at will. Now what's really cool about this is that it can sort of simulate foreshortening where an elbow or a knee is turning towards the camera. And it can also occasionally get you out of some tough situations where you have a difficult switch between one IK orientation and another IK orientation, or even IK popping or other problems that can sometimes arise when you're dealing with IK systems. So this definitely falls under the category of a bell or a whistle. It's not something you're going to need in most situations, but if the animation calls for it, or if you happen to know there's going to be some very complicated bits of animation with a lot of difficult limb movement, you may want to add this control. Now you can't add this control after your arm has already been rigged with an IK system. This control needs to be built into both the original FK and IK system that you set up with your arm or leg. So if you have already added IK to your arm and you want to add an elbow control, you're going to have to remove the current IK system. And for instructions how to do that, you can look at the ARM PDF. But usually you just want to plan ahead, and if you want to have elbow control or knee control, you'll just build it in from the get-go. Now the other thing that's important to understand about elbow or knee control is that it allows you to position the elbow anywhere you want, which means the upper and lower arms must be able to deform or stretch. And so for that reason, you can only do this with either a puppet tool upper and lower arm or a blended joint upper and lower arm, so that you have that flexibility, that stretching capability on the limbs. So let's start by taking a look at just a simple puppet tool rig and how we add this elbow control. We're also going to look at two different versions of the user interface. We'll do a point controller for these first ones, and then we'll also look at doing a click and drag control for this. So we've got quite a bit of our work done for us here. We're going to be focusing on this right arm. We've already got our puppet pins placed and our bone nulls created. And we've even got some starch in there too, just so we can focus on adding that elbow control. So what we're going to do is we're going to select the lower arm null, which of course is at the elbow position, and we're going to create a controller right there. And let's drag that down into place here, in between the upper and lower arm nulls. And I'm just going to add to the end of its name, capital I, capital K, IK. And let's just size this down a little. And we called this IK because this is now the null that we are going to use to create first our FK parenting chain and then our IK chain. We're not going to include the actual bone null that, let's remember, is actually driving the artwork. So let's go ahead and parent this together. The hand comp will parent to the wrist. Now the wrist, instead of parenting it to the lower arm bone null, we're going to parent it to that IK null that we just created. Then we'll take the IK null and we'll parent that to the upper arm, and there's our FK chain. Then we'll take the actual lower arm bone null and we'll parent that also to that lower arm IK null, and we'll take the artwork and parent that to the upper arm null as usual. Okay, and let's go ahead and create our IK chain. So we're going to select the wrist, the lower arm IK null, and the upper arm, and then our right hand controller, IK, two-layer IK with goal. And as you can see, when we click and drag our arm, we've got our IK all working normally. Everything looks good. But because we've added this additional null into our chain and parented the actual bone null that drives the artwork to it, we can now independently move that bone null without actually disturbing the functionality of the IK chain, which is pretty awesome. So all we need to do now is zero out that position value of that bone null, lock our effect control window where we already have our point controller in place, and of course we've zeroed out those values on that elbow controller, and of course we just option click and tie that in. So once again our IK all works normally, but we can now adjust these values and we can reposition that elbow. For example, creating a sense of foreshortening or fixing a potential problem. Next up we have a blended joint rig set up. That's where we have puppet tools on both individual upper and lower arm layers, and it allows us to have the look of jointing but with stretchy capability, and it allows for this auxiliary elbow control while still again having that crisp jointed look. So the parenting here gets a little bit trickier, but the principle is exactly the same. So we can select really either one of our elbow nulls here and create a controller, and we'll name that IK as well. And then now we want to kind of combine the parenting for a blended joint rig, but just inserting this additional null into the proceedings, so it is actually the null again that we use for our IK chain. So let's kind of build the FK chain first so we're clear on how this works, and then we'll add the other layers in. So the hand to the wrist, of course, and then the wrist will go all the way up to that IK elbow, and then the IK elbow to the shoulder. And there is our FK chain on which our IK chain will be built. Then we want to take the lower arm elbow and parent that to the upper arm elbow. The upper arm elbow will parent to the IK elbow. So it's kind of its own little FK chain just of elbow nulls, all leading to the root at the IK null. Then we want to add our artwork in too. So we'll parent the lower arm to the lower arm elbow null and the upper arm artwork to the upper arm shoulder null. Now let's go ahead and create our IK chain. So wrist, elbow IK, shoulder, controller. Let's unlock our effect control window here, and you can see we've also got our position controller already in place here, zeroed out. So we've now got our IK system working, but we've also got our stretchiness thanks to our blended joint rig. Let's go ahead and relock that effect control window. Now we just need to grab the upper arm elbow null, which remember has the lower arm elbow null parented to it, so that it now drives the artwork, and we'll zero out that position value and tie that to our elbow controller. So you can see just a slightly more complicated version of exactly the same thing, but now again we can take advantage of that great IK, and we can also totally screw around and manipulate with that elbow position. Alright, now if you're a fan of click and drag controllers, we can do this with a click and drag control too. We've actually got these basically already rigged, we just need to tie in the elbow controller. So our IK here is already set up, and now we're working with just the puppet tool, not the blended joint, but just a plain puppet tool upper and lower arm. And you can see we've already added a click and drag controller for the elbow. And here's our bone null that's actually driving the artwork. And of course that's currently parented to the IK null that's part of our IK system. And what we're going to do is we're just going to create a little parenting loop, kind of like what we did with the head controller. So we're going to take that bone null and we're going to parent that to the elbow controller. But remember, we want that to follow the IK system, and we want the controller to follow the IK system too, so that's all moving automatically when we're just posing the arm normally. So then we're going to take that elbow control and loop that back to the lower arm IK null. And again, that creates that little loop back around. So our basic parenting structure hasn't changed. We've just inserted this control null in between these other two nulls. So now we can click and drag and we get our IK just like we expect to, but we can also click and drag on this elbow and we can independently move that elbow around. Now you'll notice it gets a little weird when I go up and down. That is because we have starch on the upper and lower arm here, and it does start to interfere with that starch a little bit. So there's only so much you can do unless you're willing to go with virtually no starch. This works really, really well for rubber hosey type characters where there isn't any starch and you can just squish and squash that elbow position around all you want. The last one we'll look at here is a blended joint rig. And once again, it's already set up for us here. And the procedure is exactly the same. We're going to take the upper arm elbow null that is parented directly to the IK null, and we'll parent that to the left elbow controller there. And then again, to complete our parenting loop, parent that back down to the IK null. All right, now once again, we have our IK all working normally, but we can click and drag and reposition this elbow. And look, do you notice something different? Notice that in this situation with the blended rig, I can put this elbow wherever I want and it still looks good. That's because we don't have starch on the upper and lower arm. We simply have starch in balls over the overlap. So we're stretching right in the middle of the limbs, which allows us to really position this elbow wherever we want. So the very, very best combination is really a blended rig with the elbow control. Gives you the greatest posing opportunities and range of motion. Let's just do a little bit of cleanup here. We'll zero out our controllers, turn off the visibility of the nulls, lock and shy everything up. So auxiliary elbow or knee control is not something you're going to necessarily need in everyday rigging, but it sure is a nice control to have when you need it.